Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Friday, June 7th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about Greg Sankey and how he might just be the future of college football as a leader, big-time guy in the future of college football. Then we'll get into some news around analysts, how analysts might be off the field going forward. Definitely some different ways that teams are trying to cut costs, I suppose is the best way to put it. And then we'll get into some betting lines for the national championship winner and how some people are tying their wagon to a horse that I wouldn't necessarily do if I was them. But then we'll get into the playoff schedule, the TV and times for all of the games that are coming up this year before we finish it off with a recruiting update. Tons of stuff has happened throughout the week that I want to get you all updated on. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's fun for all of us. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about Greg Sankey, because he's one of the most important people in college football, and especially now when there is a huge void in terms of leadership in college football, he's more important than probably anyone else. I think there's a lot of people in this sport that look at him as kind of the person to usher us into this kind of new future that we have, and some of that is a good thing, some of that is not so good a thing. I think him and Tony Petitti are kind of sitting in a kind of world of their own, sort of, in the college football world when we talk about the power to kind of make their own decisions, do the things that they want to do, and possibly even break off and do their entirely own thing. And I think a lot of this stuff started with the NCAA just not necessarily being where they should be. And we've talked about this a lot, being late to the NIL party, being late to the transfer portal, being late to a lot of the things that they needed to be early on, or this stuff was going to start to happen. And it feels like it's not only the fans that feel this way, it is Greg Sankey as well. There were a couple of meetings throughout the last couple of years where they were trying to figure all this out. They were trying to figure out, what the next step is for revenue sharing and for transfer portal and NIL and everything in between. And a lot of those meetings, as you can probably imagine with the NCAA, didn't necessarily get a lot done. There were a lot of people in that room just kind of going back and forth, not necessarily getting to conclusions that they needed to get to. And it felt like at some point Greg Sankey got a little bit upset, and he's been a little bit more outspoken throughout this time, and especially during the SEC spring meetings. He was very outspoken about some of the issues that he has, and quote-unquote, as he said it, sometimes you have to be a jerk, and you just have to, move forward and make the decision to get that 1% step forward instead of standing still and just worrying about the, consequences or the things that possibly could happen. You got to take that step forward and then deal with the landscape as it comes. So it's one of those things that is going to be really fascinating to watch. I mean, the SEC and the Big Ten are in a situation where they hold essentially all the cards, with all of the different things that are happening in the sport, with the new things that are going to be on the checkbooks for a lot of these different athletic departments, with transfer portal, with NIL, with everything in between. There's definitely a lot more pushing in their direction, right? And especially in Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti's direction. And the good news for Greg Sankey is he has just a little bit more experience in this world than Tony Petitti does in terms of being a conference commissioner. He was the conference commissioner in the Southland Conference from 1996 to 2002. If you don't know what the Southland Conference is, look it up because it's one of the most beautiful conferences ever. Every school is within like 100 miles of each other, so it's definitely a little bit of a blast from the past there. But it's one of those things where he's seen every side of the sport. There's been, times when he's been, obviously, the commissioner of the Southland Conference has to deal with very different things than the SEC. So it's going to be really interesting to see what he kind of goes forward as. Does he totally hitch his wagon to the SEC, and are they moving forward as their own entity? Maybe him and the Big Ten move on and start their own little world off in kind of the distance because they have the ability to do that. Maybe he pushes for college football and college basketball to break off. He has a ton of different ideas, and I can't necessarily say that I agree with all of them, but what I can say is this guy is very smart, and he knows exactly what this sport is up against, and he knows that there are a lot of people up top that aren't super concerned with actually fixing the problem. They're more concerned with looking at it, saying it's a problem, and hoping that everyone will come to them for them to fix it. So I think it's one of those things where you look at Greg Sankey, you look at Tony Petitti, even Brett Yormark is someone that I think is going to have a ton of power when we go into the future of the sport, and you wonder what their future is in terms of their position. Is Greg Sankey going to be the SEC commissioner for the next decade? Or is he someone that maybe breaks off and becomes the college football commissioner, as a lot of people have dubbed it? And I think that's something that has gotten a lot of backing from a ton of college football fans, some coaches, some different people that know him, because they understand what he's about, and they understand that he fully gets this sport and fully understands college sports in a multitude of different ways. So I think when you look at Greg Sankey, he's one of those guys that's a little bit of an enigma in the sense of he has all this power, he has all this ability, but he kind of moves in silence, which is probably the right way to go about it, if we're being totally honest. He's outspoken when he needs to. There's no two ways about that, but there's definitely been times in his career where he's just kind of been the person that is leading the biggest conference in the world, but isn't necessarily the most outspoken person in the world. But the last couple of years have really brought out that side of him, and I think it's brought out that side of a lot of people around college football, and I totally understand that. So I think he's one of those people, when you look at his, past with being at the Southland Conference and going to the SEC and making his way up from even being just I believe he was just some type of athletic assistant at one of these schools, and worked his way pretty much all the way up through all the ranks. So he understands what every athletic department is going through, because he's been in a lot of these positions, and he's had to deal with some of the problems. Now, the problems have changed very drastically in the last couple of years, and he understands that as well. But I think it's one of those things where when we go into the new future of college football, when we figure out, where all this money from the House versus NCAA case is going, and once we figure out what conference realignment is going to look like in 5 years from now or whatever, we need someone at the front that everyone can look at and say, I know that guy knows what he's doing. I know that guy understands the sport. He understands the rigors of everything that is going on around it. And not only that, they trust him and they actually kind of believe in him. And that's something that I think we can say pretty confidently about Greg Sankey. He's not necessarily the perfect person. He's not necessarily, curated to be, the perfect NCAA commissioner, but I'm not sure anyone is. I'm not sure anyone is capable of doing this job absolutely perfectly, but I do know that currently the NCAA and the way that things are working is not the way to go about it. So I think he's one of those guys that is going to be looked towards a lot, whether that's, him as the SEC commissioner, or that's him as the college football commissioner, or something totally different and a totally new title with a new governing body. I don't really know what that looks like, but the reality is we need someone at the forefront of the sport. We need a voice that is consistent, that is, loud, that everyone understands, that everyone listens to, and you'd be hard-pressed to find someone that fits that criteria better than Greg Sankey. And I think he's one of those people that I don't necessarily agree with everything that he has to say. He does lean a little bit into the SEC and the Big Ten being the power brokers and maybe leaving some of the smaller conferences behind. I know he has a idea, or he is one of the backers of expanding the basketball tournament for the NCAA, which I don't like one bit, but that's totally beside the point. But he's one of those people that fully understands college sports, and he's been in a lot of different positions. He's dealt with a lot of different people. He has tons of different connections, and I think that's kind of the crux of this argument, where you have a guy who has been the leader of probably the most influential, one of the biggest conferences in college football over the last decade. And when you talk about that, that means he has access to guys like Nick Saban, like Kirby Smart, like some of the former athletes that have come through, because they know him. They've met him. They've kind of interacted with him, and definitely are doing an incredible job and believe in him because he's done such an incredible job at the SEC. So I think it's one of those positions where college football for so long has been a lot of people that don't fully understand the sport or don't fully love the sport the same way that you and I do, making decisions about the sport. And that's never the way that we wanted things to go about. And I think Greg Sankey, at the very least, would be a very big step in the right direction in terms of that. So I think he's someone that not only, we can feel confident, cares about the sport, understands the sport, but also has connections in the sport that can help him down the road, where there's going to be decisions that he doesn't fully understand because he hasn't been a head coach or he hasn't been a player in this new reality. So he's going to have to lean out and, get a little bit of help from maybe Nick Saban or from some of the former coaches or some of the former players that he has dealt with in the past. And I think when doing that, if the NCAA were to call some of these people, I don't necessarily think they get the access that Greg Sankey would. So a lot of the future of college football is really just about putting someone at the forefront that everyone can point to and say, I trust that guy, or say, I believe in that guy, or whatever that looks like. You have to have someone that everyone is willing to rally behind and everyone's willing to help out, find out all these answers. And it feels like a lot of people, including Greg Sankey, are distancing themselves from the NCAA instead of going towards that and trying to figure out the problem. And I think it's not necessarily because they don't care about fixing the problem. I think it's more they don't trust the NCAA to take their actual worries into account. And I'd love to tell you that they're wrong to think that, but I can't necessarily say that. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch this kind of new era unfold. Is Greg Sankey just going to break off the SEC and maybe join and bring Tony Petitti and the Big Ten with them and be their own entity? Is the college football going to break off and he be the college football commissioner? Is he going to stay with the SEC and just, dominate over there? Who knows what the future holds? But what I can say with absolute confidence is this is one of the most powerful guys in the sport, and he will be for quite some time to come. And I think his power is only getting bigger, if I'm being totally honest. So he's going to be really, really fascinating to watch. I think when you look at college football and you look at who is defining the sport the most, it's really hard to overlook Greg Sankey. And I think he might just be at the very top of that list, and we might just need him to be right about now. But we'll take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about analysts. It sounds like with the House settlement and all of the new money that is going to have to be paid by some athletic departments, they're trying to cut costs, and some of those costs might be the analysts that have been on the field for a number of big programs throughout history. So I'll break that down and how it's going to affect some of these schools right after this, so stick with us.